All right, the whole purpose of this section of the course is to teach you how to write a critique, which of course means that I have to teach you how to read for critique. So that means what you have to do, in a writing or in a reading, is you have to introduce the author, and you have to introduce the article to be criticized, which means you have to understand who the author is, and you have to understand who the article is, which is what we did in the first paper, which is summary. Every good critique has a good summary at its core. Second thing you want to do is sum up the article, just like we've done before. If you don't like the template that's in the book that I'm demonstrating, then come up with your own, just so long as it gets the same amount or more done. So sum up the article. The next step is to evaluate the validity of the piece. In other words, assess the quality of Krauthammer's piece about the moon. In other words, is the material in the article accurate? Is it significant? Because there could be just a bunch of fill in there that have no significance for the purpose of the piece. Are the terms clear and clearly defined? Is it fair? And is it logical? Those are just 5. There are lots more ways to evaluate, but if you do these 5, then you've got it licked. After you've done the evaluation or the assessment, then the next step is to respond to the presentation. In other words, whether you agree or disagree with it. Sometimes you can do both, and occasionally you might argue that the author completely misses the boat and it's neither, and suggest your own article. Now this is where critique is different than summary. Critiques do ask you to evaluate fairly, but they do ask you to do so. Summaries don't. The last thing you need to do is to sum up your assessment. This is a very simple template, and some people might argue it's not very creative, but there's a lot of intellectual activity going on inside here. Summing it up, you got to break this down into the stages of thought, which you've already done if you have done the first Google form. You have to evaluate its validity. You have to look at the assumptions in the article, and you have to look at how the writer works with the information. And then you have to agree or disagree and put yourself a little bit on the line. So you might argue that it's not creative, but it's only as creative as your own intellect is. So, like most templates, yes, it can be, like the 5-paragraph theme, a bit of a monster that doesn't do anything. But if you take it seriously and you use it to learn from, then it is a profoundly simple but powerful tool for both reading and writing. This is an elaboration of what I just talked about and wrote about on screen. And this is from the textbook, and it's a guideline for writing critiques. You'll notice that it pretty much follows, that I pretty much follow it. And the reason I do is because I've not found anything better as a way of managing my workflow. When I need to get stuff done, when I need to critique something, I need to have a plan. And if I don't have a plan, then I'm kind of flailing around, and sometimes it works out, and sometimes it doesn't. But inevitably, I discover that when it does work out, it's because I have, in some way, followed carefully, or maybe accidentally, just followed this plan. So I'm just gonna reiterate what I said earlier. So the first part, you have to introduce your topic. Your author, and the passage in the article you're writing about. Maybe you need to give some background material, help the reader understand. Remember, this is all about audience. I know that's not very readable. I have to live with it, I guess. Then I want you to summarize the main points and make sure you state the author's purpose for writing. And you want to make sure that that is both specific and, in other words, BS, only and that means be specific, and be overt. Tell us what it is. Help your reader out. All right. This is where the next step is to assess the presentation. This is where you evaluate things. Like I said before, accurate, significant, define terms clearly, fair information use, and logical information use. Man, if you do all 5 of these, you have a deep understanding of the article that nobody can take away from you. And I know people discount reading these days, but reading is a tremendously powerful skill, tool, way of thinking, way of looking at the world. Don't discount it, because it takes work to become a good reader. Next, I want you to respond to the presentation, and that is, do you agree? Do you disagree? And discuss your reasons for agreement. You can't just say, yeah, that sucks. You have to tell me why it sucks. And it's good to look at, and we're going to look at this when we actually do the assessment in the next slide. You have to look at the assumptions. What is kind of hidden underneath? What does he assume? And if you need to, you can draw on outside sources to support your ideas. Lastly, you need to conclude, and that's kind of a summary of your assessment. Remind them, this is good, this is not so good, and do an overall. You say, well, I agree in part and disagree in part, but mostly I disagreed, and on the whole, the article is unfair. It has many logical fallacies in it, including false dichotomy, and it's probably not worth reading. Now, that was just kind of a off-the-cuff sort of summary there, but you get the notion is that you have to tell your reader again, okay, by the way, this is, if you didn't get it up above, this is what I said. It's all about the audience. So the next thing we're going to talk about is, what actually happened in Krauthammer's piece. Now, this is no secret. A lot of this information is going to come straight from the book. So if you get lost, go back to the book and read it. There are 2 main questions that we need to consider in a critique. The first one is the extent to which the author succeeds in his or her purpose. I mean, how else are you going to judge a piece? If an author says, my purpose is to give information, well, then you have to judge them based upon that. Or if the idea is that it's a call to action, well, part of that is, do they succeed in their call to action? Whatever their purpose is, whether it's to inform or persuade or to entertain or some combination of all 3 of those, or something outside that. The second part of this, the second question that you need to ask and answer in a critique is, to what extent do you agree with the author? agree, disagree, both, neither. And you have to evaluate the assumptions. So, to sum up, as long as you carefully articulate the author's assumptions and your own, and you explain in some detail your agreement and disagree with them, the critique is pretty much yours to take in whatever direction you see fit. That's a direct quote from the book. So let's get started. All right, now we have the piece itself, and we have to ask, to what extent does the author succeed in his purpose? And so what is Krauthammer's purpose in writing The Moon We Left Behind? Well, it's to persuade. It's to persuade you that manned spaceflight needs to be supported. And this is a big issue now, 6-7 years later, because of the Mars program. So this is still a valid consideration. In fact, we ought to write him an email suggesting that he update his post. So how does he make his persuasive case? First, he argues against the Obama administration's really kind of abandonment of the moon. That's what it amounts to. That's what he says it amounts to. The moon we left behind. Well, we abandoned the moon. Okay, that's the idea. And who's president? Who's in charge of the space program? The commander-in-chief, the president, and that would be Obama. Secondly, he argues for the continuation of the program. And he does that in here, especially in here. And then at the end, he rebuts the criticism of the program. That's that in here. Okay. So the next thing we have to do is look at the assumptions. There are sprinkled throughout an assumption about exploration that he makes. And also that going to the moon is, how should we say it, it's worth it, even though we do have problems on this planet. And she spends most of the article trying to back up these assumptions. So one critique of the exploration side of this argument might be that, yeah, we do have this urge to explore, but it's not limited to space. Most of the sea is unexplored. Most of the genome is mapped, but basically unexplored. The idea that space travel is privileged over these other forms of exploration is absurd. So, oftentimes, the exploration of the dirt and rocks under our feet is much more rewarding for all of humanity than the exploration of rocks and dirt on the moon. And the second question is it worth it? Is it worth our time, effort, and money? And he argues that he just assumes that it is worth it, that what we've gotten before we'll get again. That may not be necessarily the case. It might be that it's not inspiring anymore, that people go to the moon and discover that it is different the second time around, and that it becomes more, okay, how can we stay here? How can we build a place on the moon? And it might not be inspiring at all. So you can continue along these lines in evaluating the assumptions, and you can evaluate whether the author succeeds in his purpose. And that really is what a critique is. For example, is it fair that he argues that the image of the Earth, the blue planet, was one of the most important things we brought back from the moon? We've actually had that image ever since we had unmanned flights, unmanned flights around the moon, unmanned and even manned flights that didn't land on the moon. So is that image worth the image that we already had, worth it? I'm not so sure it is. So take a look at the critique, the model critique, which is on pages 70 to 75 in the book. And you'll see what an A critique looks like. We'll talk some more about this as we go throughout the week.